Uh, Great to see you all, and thank you for coming. My name is Rasen Jagalov. I teach in the Russian and Slavic department here, and it's really my great pleasure to be introducing Professor Polly Jones, who teaches at the University of Oxford, and more specifically is a fellow in Slavonic Studies at the Oxford University College, and one of the leading scholars of post-Soviet era, post-Stalin era literature and cultural history. I met Professor Jones 15 years ago at a workshop at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and each of her texts I've read ever since has been a revelation. A central theme in much of her writing, and certainly her two books, is the way that memories of Soviet and pre-Soviet experiences have been articulated in officially published samizdat narratives in the Khrushchev, Brezhnev, and Gorbachev eras. Thus, her first book, which came out in 2013, Myth, Memory, Trauma, Rethinking the Stalinist Past in the Soviet Union from 1953 to 1970, explores a wide range of reactions to the narratives, to the new narratives of Stalinism in party statements and in Soviet literature and historiography. Engaging with the field of memory studies, this book represented the first sustained comparison of this process with other countries' attempts to rethink their own difficult pasts. It earned her a spot as a consultant on the film, which I hope all of you have seen, Armando Iannucci's 2017, The Death of Stalin. The book also was then
Follow me to my death day. It's fantastic.
The book was then followed by another one in 2019, The Revolution Rekindled, the writers and readers of late Soviet biography, which took as its object a book series initiated in the late Khrushchev era, the fiery revolutionaries, Pламенные революционеры, which was launched to rekindle popular enthusiasm for the revolution and published over 150 books before getting closed in the early 1990s. Professor Jones has also edited multiple volumes and special issues, the best known of which is probably Dilemmas of Destalinization, negotiating social and political change in the Khrushchev era, but I would also mention Writing Russian Lives, the poetics and politics of Russian biography, and the relaunch of the Soviet project, 1945 to 1964, a special issue of Slavonic and East European Review. Professor Jones is currently engaged in multiple projects, including the collaborative The 101st Kilometer, Provincial Marginality from Stalin to Gorbachev, which explores the migration and settlement patterns in communities produced by Soviet restrictions on residency in major Russian, Ukrainian, and Latvian cities for Gulag returnees and other marginals, which, as you know, famously, many of which could not live within 101 kilometers of certain big cities. So Professor Jones is also working on contemporary political prisoner writing in the era. And so we are very lucky that she has come today to New York to tell us about her latest book, Gulag Fiction, Labor Camp Literature from Stalin to Putin, out from Bloomsbury Press earlier this year. Over to you, Polly.
Thank you so much, Rosen, for that incredibly and characteristically gracious introduction. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be here. I'd also like to thank Sasha for all her help in coordinating my trip to New York. So as Rosen said, today I'll be essentially presenting in sort of compressed form the key arguments of this book, which you can see on the introductory slide, Gulag Fiction. I should say straight away that it's part of the Bloomsbury Russian short series, which several of your colleagues here have also published in. It's a 40,000 word book, which attempts to compress 100 years of Gulag literary history. So it's necessarily some of what I say, both in the book and especially today, will be somewhat sort of telegraphic or telescopic, but I'm very happy to expand on that in the Q&A. The book's coming out in, I guess, in Kindle in a couple of weeks' time, and in hard copy in November of this year. So it's an exciting period where I myself have not yet held the book in my hands. Like all good research projects, this one began with a puzzle, or maybe several. One was these. Moving on for some reason.
You will try on re-entering share screen.
Sorry, everyone. Sorry about that. So one of the puzzles that this all originated was was these two TV series of 2020 and 2021. They were broadcast to millions of watchers on Russian state TV's Channel 1, Первый канал. And they were based on two best-selling and prize-winning novels of the 2010s, Guzel Yakin's Zuleyka Opens Her Eyes and Zakhar Pilyepin's The Abode. What was puzzling to me about these TV series and about the novels as well was they didn't really seem to fit, but particularly the TV series, was they didn't really seem to fit with the increasing moves by the authorities by that point to constrain Gulag commemoration or even discussion, for example, attacks on Memorial and many other such events. So Yakina's novel and its TV adaptation told the story of a young Tatar woman swept up in the dekulakization of the 1930s and sent off to a Siberian special settlement, which was part of the Gulag network. So it certainly emphasizes the suffering there, but the narrative also charts, as its title suggests, Zuleyka's emancipation from the constraints of traditional Tatar culture. The settlement, special settlement, affords opportunities for enlightenment, friendship, skills development, and even sexual liberation when she falls in love with the settlement boss, Ignatov. Prilyepin, who, as I'm sure you know, is notorious for his links to the Russian state and now under sanctions in support of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, also presented an ambivalent picture in his novel of the prototype of the Gulag, Solovki. The novel and the TV series are, I would say, much franker than Yakina's novel about physical suffering, but they're also fascinated by Solovki as a unique political, intellectual, and moral experiment by his charismatic late 1920s boss, Fyodor Eichmann, and you can see the actor who plays him here. I'll return to both these novels a bit later on, but suffice it to say for now that both are very ambiguous about the camps and their effects on their inmates. So that ambiguity helped to solve one aspect of the puzzle. I think these stories help to prove that there is no official silencing of the Gulag past, and they're still not now, I would argue, but they promote nationwide a very different narrative than than the investigations and criticisms of Memorial, the Sakharov Center, and other such NGO activity. This also, I think, accords with otherwise sort of difficult to explain aspects of recent Gulag commemoration, such as the state-sponsored Wall of Sorrow here on the right, which was opened in 2017, and the recurated and more sanitized Gulag museums in Moscow and Perm, most notably. But this raises another set of questions. How can we fit this kind of Gulag writing within Gulag prose? Or does it maybe make us reconsider or redefine what Gulag fiction is, who writes it, and why? So I wanted in this book to try to offer maybe a more inclusive account of Gulag literary prose, with a place and an explanation for texts such as Yakina's and Prilyepin's, alongside much more canonical works by former Gulag inmates, especially Solzhenitsyn and Shalam. The book brings together approximately 35 works of Gulag fiction, and I'll come back to that definition shortly, from the 1920s to the 2020s. It builds on some outstanding histories of Gulag writing, notably by a pioneer really in this field, Leona Toka, and also on some welcome, more recent attempts to look at camp literature, concentration camp literature, in comparative, international, and transnational perspective. Much of the works here and others were written before the latest wave of what's been called new camp prose, or too soon after it to be able to take stock of it. But I think it's also true that most approaches to Gulag literature have been shaped by assumptions that it's only or certainly its most legitimate form was the prose of camp survivors. Now, there are many really excellent aesthetic and ethical reasons to prioritize this writing, and I hope I don't deprioritize it myself. But if we define Gulag literature not only as survivor testimony, but as literature set in or fundamentally concerned with the Gulag, then we can see straight away that it's been written by many other authors with very different stakes in the topic and not just in the 21st century. These include children, grandchildren, or even great-grandchildren of camp inmates, such as Georgy Vladimir, Vasily Aksionov, Bulata Pujava, as well as Yakinam Prilepin. Those with other connections to or roles in the camp, such as former guard Sergei Davlatov, or a step-grandchild of a camp boss, Sergei Lebedev, and increasingly those with no direct connection to the camps. So Gulag literature has naturally shifted over time from memory to historical research and post-memory, as Marianne Hirsch famously termed memories partly transmitted or recuperated from earlier generations. Of course, it's more complicated to map the Gulag onto generations, given that parts of it survived and evolved until the late 80s. But it's also true to say that no writer under the age of 50, like most of the contemporary authors that I'll talk about, can write about the Soviet camps from direct experience, although they do typically undertake substantial research, archive and oral history research. But it's still true that the aesthetic and ethical stakes of writing about the camps inevitably shift over time. And indeed, Gulag prose of the 2010s and early 2020s is more diverse than ever. There are epic novels, quasi-documentary texts, love stories, tales of ghosts, and the uncanny. And in fact, another puzzle that set me on the path to writing this book was how to fit these novels, these 2010 novels, such as Yevgeny Vatalaskyn's Aviator, about a cryogenically frozen Zek returning to 1990s Russia, or Sergei Lebedev's Gothic tale of haunting by a former Gulag boss's ghost, The Limit of Forgetting. So how to fit text like this within the tradition. So the question fundamentally that the book asks then is, can and should all of these authors and texts be grouped together into a single genre? And is it helpful to term that Gulag fiction and to define it as such? And as I perhaps already alluded to, this question of fiction is, of course, vexed. Many previous studies of Gulag literature blur the boundaries between memoir and literary narrative. They look at both, partly, of course, because authors, especially if they were Gulag survivors, often did so themselves. They used themselves, their experiences, other prison acquaintances as prototypes or informants, and they blended literary writing often with personal activism, especially in memory politics. Combined with a pervasive Soviet-era ignorance of the Gulag, then, this helped to make these texts what Leona Toka usefully calls bifunctional. That is, they were read for information first and only later as art. And this documentary or auto-fictional or autobiographical prism also sidelined authors who had not personally experienced imprisonment. And this only becomes more difficult or problematic as the genre, of course, becomes more and more dominated by those without that direct experience. So, in an attempt to resolve, or maybe look at these, or at least look at these difficulties from a different perspective, I draw on the more developed conceptualization of Holocaust fiction. I think because it's a larger and a better known corpus, but especially because it's been more vulnerable to accusations that it's kind of aestheticizing total atrocity, Holocaust fiction has seen much more work done on defining different types or phases of fictionalization. So broadly speaking, studies of Holocaust fiction often trace shifts from testimonial or quasi-documentary forms to greater experimentation. And also these shifts often generate controversy and unease about representing atrocity or misrepresenting it, but they've also generated some really, I think, robust defenses of the importance of fictional narrative and its unique role. So Holocaust literary scholar Sue Weiss, for example, argues that Holocaust fiction should not be seen as what she calls a failed supplement to the memoir corpus, and that it is, quote, the polyphonic testing of certainties which gives Holocaust fiction its particular representational power. Emily Miller-Budick agrees that fiction does a special kind of narrative work, especially in exploring multi-layered subjectivities and deepening and producing nuances in our ethical thinking. So I find these insights really helpful, and they inform the way I sort of approached the topic in the book. Of course, the fact that the camp's representation has inevitably become more fictional over time does not necessarily shield Holocaust fiction and film from ongoing accusations of insensitivity or even immorality. And it seems to me that there are some intriguing comparisons here as well with the Russian case. because the Gulag has generally provoked a lot less scandal over appropriate forms of its artistic representation. And I'd argue that's because it's never been categorically condemned in Russia or arguably anywhere else. And this ambivalence, I think, over the sort of moral status of the Gulag and the stakes in sort of representing it in art have only deepened in the last decade. And it's this, I think, that's fueled the recent growth and diversification of Gulag fiction in the 2010s and 2020s, and indeed its prominence in other media, such as the TV series I started with. So my talk today is divided into three main categories, as the title suggested, that shape this narrative of the Gulag tradition. So goners, grey zones, and grandparents. And I'll spend the most time on the first of those, but I'll cover all three. And I just want to briefly explain before I move into each of those three. So in the first part, I go back to the origins and the bedrock of the Gulag tradition, that is the prose of camp survivors. Here, I think it's a, sorry, this is, here it's a particular challenge to say anything new, given that there's an enormous and excellent scholarship on Solzhenitsyn and Shalamov, but I sort of shape the narrative around the fundamental difference between them. That is, whether the camps destroyed prisoners' bodies and souls, turning them into goners on the brink of life or death, and what that then means in narrative terms. And then I argue this core debate resonates through the Gulag tradition ever since. So I bring in lesser-known contemporaries, notably Georgy Demidov, and also contemporary Gulag prose's ongoing debates about prisoner subjectivity and spirituality. So in the second part of the talk, I highlight the enduring and complex, but I think still underappreciated strand of Gulag literature that considers perpetration and what Primo Levi famously called the grey zones of other forms of complicity with atrocity. We can clearly see the importance of perpetrator fiction in the boss protagonists in Yakina, Prilepin, Lebedev, and others, but fascination with perpetrators and grey zones can be traced much further back. And especially to works of the 1960s and 70s by Vasily Grossman, Georgy Vladimov, Sergei Dovlatov, and even some former returnee prose as well. And in the last part of the talk and of the book, I consider Gulag literature's ongoing dramatizations of the kind of meta question of how and by whom the camps can and should be remembered. So these range from Soviet-era stories of camp returnees, remembering the camps and trying to get others in post-Stalinist society to do the same, to second-generation prose by children of former prisoners, and finally to contemporary fiction's striking number of dramatization of Gulag memories resonances across several generations. And these are often embodied in grandfather or great-grandfather and grandchild and great-grandchildren protagonists. And these memory texts, I'd argue, and post-memory texts, again, present some intriguing points of comparison with second and third generation and post-memory dynamics of Holocaust fiction. So to come to the first and most sort of the longest part of the book and of the talk, returnee prose. So I certainly don't intend for this account of Gulag literature to understate the immense contributions of what I see as really the two fathers of Gulag literature, Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Varlam Shalamov. And in fact, as I researched the tradition across the 20th and 21st centuries, I ended up finding their influence in even more places than I had anticipated. So the book opens with their disagreements about the camp's human or inhuman experiences. In 1962, in a long letter to Solzhenitsyn about Ivan Denisovich, which had just been published in Novy Mir, Shalamov professed himself, very much liked the novella, but professed himself struck by some euphemisms and silences about the camp's cruelty. And this is just one example. Your camp has no fleas. The guards aren't responsible for the plan. They don't beat it out of the prisoners with the butt of a gun. Tobacco by the glassful, no beatings. Bread is left in the mattress. People leave bread at home. They eat with spoons. Where is this wondrous camp? 3 years later, he offered his best known definition of his own approach in a letter to a different Gulag returnee, Georgy Demidov. And this was as he was continuing to write his own 6-volume Kolyma Tales. I'm investigating some psychological processes which happen in society when there are attempts to turn a person into a non-person. Capturing some of these conditions is the moral duty of anyone who is in Kolyma. I am raising the question of a new prose, not the prose of the document, but prose born out through suffering like a document. Solzhenitsyn, for his part, couldn't accept Shalamov's assumptions about character and characterization in camp literature. And this is a long quotation where I've highlighted the sheer number of words to do with subjectivity and personality. In all of Kalima Tales, he observed, there weren't enough characters, figures, the parts of these figures, or any kind of sense of each person's distinctive life view. What we had were not concrete, particular people, but pretty much just surnames, sometimes repeated from story to story, but without any individual features attached to them. One can assume this was part of Shalamov's intent. The extreme cruelty of camp day-to-day life wears out and crushes people. People cease to be individuals and become just sticks used by the camp. But firstly, I'm not in agreement that all features of the personality and a person's past life can be so completely destroyed. That does not happen, and so something personal needs to be shown in each person. So Shalamov's position on the camps as a place of total physical, psychological, and ethical collapse, and Solzhenitsyn's contrasting insistence that human integrity and individual could survive and even thrive there, were central to the struggle to define the essence and mission of camp literature in its most, what I see as its most formative phase. This was longer and broader than a two-man dispute, though, and I also bring in from the start, as you saw on the previous slide, a lengthy exchange of letters and a sort of debate between Shalamov and another survivor of the camps, Georgy Demidov, who defended his own right to his own view of the camps and his own approach to Gulag literature, which was distinct both from Shalamov's and Solzhenitsyn's. And he's really the figure I sort of really bring in to the narrative in the first chapter. So these debates about humanity, of course, connect to broader questions that run throughout decades of writing on both Soviet and Nazi and indeed other concentration camp systems. Ought camp literature to testify to the camp's destruction of the individual and individuality itself, as most famously argued by Giorgio Agamben, or should it focus on human resilience and survival? Does camp literature aim to foster empathy, or should it emphasize unspeakable, unimaginable suffering? I argue, following scholars including Luba Jurgensen and Valery Podoroga, amongst many others, that Shalamov is the only true exponent in the Gulag tradition of Agamben's belief about the camps as a state of exception, whose quintessential victim is the dehumanized goner. In general, Gulag prose has been reluctant, even when censorship was less of a factor, to represent camp experience as total dehumanization. So Shalamov's stature in the tradition derives more from his uniqueness than his imitators. So to come to Shalamov first, and again, this is something that, again, these remarks are going to be necessarily brief. The Gulag was the defining experience of Avram Shalamov's life. It left deep physical and mental scars. Arrested in the late 20s and again during the terror at the end of the 30s, he served close to 20 years in the camps, including the harshest camp, Kalima. His post-Gulag years were consumed by the desire to confront these recollections and commemorate others who had perished. Such testimony was painful for him and also for others. Each story he once claimed is a slap in the face of Stalinism. When Shalamov left the camps and started writing Kalima Tales, he believed that literature could not be didactic or moralizing after the atrocities, which he very much compared, of Kalima, Auschwitz, and Hiroshima. It must also turn away from the Russian humanist tradition. What he called the new prose was characterized by absolute authenticity and documentary truth, and sawn down to the most laconic and least embellished form. Unlike Solzhenitsyn, he insisted increasingly on a prose where there is, quote, no description, no characters, no portraits, no development of character. But he was fundamentally interested in human experience and professed himself to be seeking new forms to capture, quote, how the human soul, its limits, its moral boundaries were stretched beyond limits in camps such as Kalima. So the 6 volumes of Kalima Tales, published in Tamizdat from the 70s, do indeed stretch conventions of plot, characterization, and empathy to breaking point. The stories and cycles are linked by the pulsation of atrocity rather than linear chronology or plot. For Shalamov, Kalima was a place of bare life, and especially in the late 30s, but not only then, of mass death. He assaulted the reluctance to show death in the Soviet camps that he saw in Solzhenitsyn's work, and of course, even more so in the limited Gulag literature that was published in other Soviet venues in the early 1960s. Overall, though, Kalima Tales focuses less on death and more on the state of living death, which Agamben would later pinpoint as the essence of the camps. Time and again, in the stories, hunger, cold, and violence leave prisoners semi-sentient, feeling only indifference and spite. And this radically reduced state is often mirrored in numb, affectless narration. Some stories evoke this bare life with sympathy, but many others underscore how inappropriate humanist narrative and conventional morality are for the world of the camps. One characteristic way they do this is through shocking endings, where political prisoners eventually behave as immorally as the despised criminal prisoners as they scrabble for food or warmth in extreme life-threatening conditions. It's also worth noting, though, that some characters do resist the camp's dehumanization and ethical challenges, and sometimes altogether. Notably, the eponymous character of the first story of Shalamov's that was published in a Soviet venue in Glasnost, Pugachev, and also, interestingly, the prototype for Georgy Demidov, who he was in the camp, who he's in Kalymar with, in his story about the engineer Kipreev. And Demidov, that's sort of ironic given that they have these debates about how best to write Gulag literature. So to move on then to Solzhenitsyn, Solzhenitsyn then, as we've already seen, he proceeds from very different assumptions and produces very different narratives of Gulag human experience. Solzhenitsyn never conceived of the camps only in terms of suffering, also seeing them as sites of profound and sometimes positive mental and moral transformation, although those spiritual and psychological dimensions do depend crucially on individual personality and personal ethical choices. This is captured especially well in his polyphonic novel, The First Circle, which traces dozens of individual responses to the ethical pressures, both of life in the highest circle of the camp system in a sharashka or research laboratory, and in ostensibly free late Stalinist Moscow. Ivan Denisovich presents a more ambivalent picture of a single ordinary Zek's psychology through its use of two unreconciled narrative perspectives. These leave it unclear whether Ivan stays true to his personality and ethical code, or whether imprisonment and hard labor diminish them. Khrushchev himself famously overlooked this potential pessimism to grant publication, but it wasn't long before most Soviet critics would turn on the text for exactly that reason. But even so, Ivan Denisovich was by far the most important Gulag narrative published in the Soviet Union before Glasnost, and it provided a crucial point of comparison, not just for Shalamov, which is relatively well known, but also for his less known correspondent, Georgy Demidov. So in 1990, Aganyok, the magazine, published The Stiff, Dubar, marking the first time that Demidov's work had reached the wider Soviet public after confiscation of all of his manuscripts by the KGB in the early 1980s. The story The Stiff was written in 1964 and inspired by Ivan Denisovich, but it also deliberately makes it unfamiliar. It recasts numerous details of its camp narrative and ultimately refines its overall view of Gulag humanity or inhumanity. It tells the story of a Zek who's assigned to bury a newborn baby's corpse. And during this experience, he has a deep, though brief, spiritual and emotional experience. It's a really astonishing story. If those of you who don't know, I really recommend it. The story intertwines death, vitality, and spirituality in a very different way from Solzhenitsyn's Ivan Denisovich and also his other Gulag prose. So is Demidov closer to Shalamov? Well, certainly like Shalamov, who, as I said, he shared several years in Kalymar, and he worked with him in Kalymar's central hospital for a period. Demidov, like Shalamov, saw significant similarities between Soviet and Nazi camps. Kalymar, he once claimed, is Auschwitz without the gas ovens. But he insisted on Zek humanity more than Shalamov as his most frequent correspondent. Demidov's stories characteristically celebrate exceptional personalities capable of extraordinary feats of a kind almost absent from Kalymar tales. But he always shows the near inevitability of their death and destruction. And one good example is his story, The Intellectual, which sort of plunges us into the consciousness of this Zek who's sort of repeatedly pushing in a sort of Sisyphean way, pushing wheelbarrows up an incline. His heart is being put under enormous strain. But for a large part of the story, he's kind of thinking about maths and music and other sort of intellectual topics. But by the end of the story, he starts to decline and dies. And eventually, obviously, then we leave his consciousness and we're left with this very bleak picture of him dying on the slope, having not managed to make sense of why, at what point in this sort of repeated ascent of the slope, people's hearts usually give out, which he'd been trying to kind of intellectualize and calculate. And that's a really typical dynamic, I think, of Demidov's stories. So they do leave the overall meaning of prisoner life and death unclear. So I see Demidov's work as a potentially productive means of moving beyond the binary opposition that's long dominated the tradition. But of course, his influence has been limited by the fact that his works were pretty much unknown really until the last 15 years or so. They're now being made into these really lovely editions, actually, which you can see on this one volume of them, of this 6-volume set of Slavonic Studies, which has the heavy involvement of Moscow's Gulag Museum, which again is a sort of slight puzzle to me of 2020's memory politics, and there are kind of podcasts and all sorts of musical projects that are arising out of Dimitrov stories. He seems to be really the kind of hot new discovery of the current period, and I think deservedly so. But for now, I would say it is still Solzhenitsyn and Shalamov and their views of prisoner selfhood and the camp's dehumanization, which represent the twin gravitational pulls. And we can see this in the 2 weightiest novels of the new Gulag prose, so we can write ahead now, Prilepin's Abode and Viktor Remizov's Permafrost. Which is the last Gulag novel published before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, published in 2021, and it bears a strong resemblance to First Circle. It paints an all-round picture of a single camp, although this is a labor camp rather than Sharashka, and this is the Igarka Polar Railway project of the late 1940s and early 1950s, so very late Stalinist project, notoriously a complete failure. Across 800 pages, it offers deep psychological portraiture of a range of prisoners, management, including briefly Stalin, accomplices, and the local population around it in the far north. Both Remizov and Prilepin's novels are much franker than most of Solzhenitsyn's prose about the extreme conditions and destructiveness of the camps. The most famous scene of Prilepin's novel is a long episode set in the Sekirka church in Solovki, where goners reach a physical nadir but a spiritual peak. Gorchakov, the main hero of Permafrost, often remembers being a goner in his previous camp and now works in Gulag medical care, so he's often sort of literally dissecting the terrible physical toll of hard labor. But at the same time, this main Zek hero enjoys some mental freedom. Rather again, like the Zeks in First Circle, he sees through the construction plans for the railway and even cautiously enjoys some debate about Stalinism with other victims of repression when he's allowed to travel off-site. So influences from both Solzhenitsyn and Shalamov clearly shape both these major novels, but for both of them also the intent is not merely to dramatize Gulag history and psychology, but to use the camps in question as broader symbols of Russian destiny, even the Russian soul, and I use the term advisedly. And this is again something that we can sort of trace back to some extent to Solzhenitsyn, and certainly in the most recent adaptation of Ivan Denisovich, we see it entirely striking to the point of being confusing, sort of reinvention of the novella as a kind of spiritual odyssey, and I can talk about that more in questions if people are interested. But clearly, probably the more important origin text here is Dostoevsky's House of the Dead. Remizov stumbled on the theme of the Gulag when he saw some ruins of former Gulag sites on a trip down the Angara River, having previously been best known as an exponent of contemporary village prose. And the unnaturalness of the Gulag and its incongruity with the Russian land is the guiding principle of his novel, I'd argue, and the source of its most powerful narrative. Time and again, Stalinist construction plans are doomed by the resistance of nature, especially the river. But at the same time, Stalinist trauma is deeply buried in the Russian land and as difficult to thaw as the titular permafrost. The Gulag thus forms part of a much longer story of Russian history, memory, and landscape. Meanwhile, Prilepin's novel shows Ekman's Solovki experiment as a fascinating failure, but again inscribes it into a much longer history of the quest for Russia's identity and destiny, with Solovki serving as an abode for Russians in spiritual torment over many centuries. And again, as you may know, these broader spiritual and nationalistic concerns are a much more durable and deep preoccupation for Prilepin than the Gulag as such. So Natalia Kovtun correctly argues, I think, that the new camp prose of the 2010s and early 2020s more broadly is ultimately closer to Solzhenitsyn's view of Zek experience than Shalamov. It does show the camps as a physical and psychological ordeal, but it doesn't usually show the kind of radical breakdown of identity and ethics that we see across Kalima tales. The critic Olga Boguslavskaya goes further and lamented in, I think, 2017 that much of the latest wave of Gulag fiction is written in a major key and offers varieties of comfort. Particularly relevant to this claim, I think, are two other major recent works of Gulag prose, Yakin and Zuleyka, which I've already mentioned, and Nikolai Kalonov's Uprising, which is a documentary novel of 2019. And I group them together as portraits of not just of endurance, but more than with Remizov and Prilepin as sagas of psychological, if not physical, liberation, though with very different roles for the Gulag in enabling that emancipation. So Kalonov is was an opposition journalist with particular interest in anti-Putin protest, but he became interested in Sergei Solovyov, a little-known leader of the Norilsk camp uprising, which features heavily in Gulag Archipelago, for example, while he was working with Memorial on something different initially, and he decided to write a novelized account of Solovyov's life. So the text extrapolates very imaginatively from very scant historical sources, including Solovyov's dream record. And it offers a broadly chronological dramatization of Solovyov's extraordinary life story. It moves from an early family history of repression through spells in several Nazi POW camps and then into Gulag camps, including Norilsk. It's one of very few works of Gulag literature to date, alongside most famously Grossman, to compare Nazi and Soviet camps. They're both shown as places of almost total collapse of the personality. But the novel climaxes in the eponymous uprising, and it shows that this kind of spirit of uprising is the kind of guiding principle of Solovyov's personality throughout his life. It prepared him to lead the uprising, but it had also sort of carried him and his essential sense of self through the ordeals of the prior camps as well. Commentary on the novel, which pretty much only appeared in liberal and opposition media at the end of the 2010s, highlighted Solovyov's absolutely non-state life and called him a hero of unofficial history and barely concealed the relevance of his life to resistance in the authoritarian present. Yakina's more mass market novel, which I've already mentioned, was based on her grandmother's experience of deportation from Tatarstan and is much more ambiguous about the role of the Gulag system in emancipating the self. Solovyov rises up uncompromisingly against a clearly inhuman system, but Zuleyka, as I mentioned earlier, finds the settlement unexpectedly offers human fulfillment, and more so than her previous home with its patriarchal violence and religious dogmatism, and you can see some sense of how she transforms in these two images from the TV series. This growing sense of self is captured in intimate, free and direct discourse, and with the reader is plunged into her transformation from what critics called an embryo of a human being to, quote, becoming conscious of herself as a thinking and feeling person. As I mentioned at the start, this transformation comes about thanks to the friendship of fellow settlers, and this is something that she talks about a lot that she got from her grandmother's testimony. The work that she performs, so she becomes known as one of the best hunters or huntresses on the settlement, the skills that she develops within the site's castle regime, and even more problematically, it's also linked to the relationship that develops between her and the settlement boss, Ignatov. Little wonder then that the novel, and especially the TV series at the start of the 2020s, proved controversial. Post-colonial scholars and Tatar observers, quite rightly, have criticised the narrative of this emancipatory Russification and Sovietization of a Tatar woman, and also her son, who's born on the settlement and then becomes increasingly Russified. So, if Gulag literature's presentation of prisoner selfhood is shaped this day by the legacies of Shalamov and especially Solzhenitsyn, narratives of life on the other side of the barbed wire and the grey zones in between tell a more complicated story. So perpetration and complicity are, I would say, secondary concerns in most prisoner-survivor prose. I think because it's primarily conceived as a form of victim testimony, especially for those who could not speak for themselves. Shalamov's stories are overwhelmingly narrated from the perspective of prisoners rather than their keepers, and this, I think, reflects his deep commitment to capture sex suffering. Camp guards and bosses are present throughout Kolyma tales. They're often sort of malevolent, brooding presence, but they're personalized in only a few stories and probed in almost none. But Demidov's prose, meanwhile, often critiques the authorities' inhumane view of prisoners as exploitable and expendable by focusing on the richness of Zek characters, as I mentioned earlier. I think there's a partial contrast here to Solzhenitsyn. So again, in his polyphonic novels, First Circle and Cancer Ward, even though that's set in the post-Stalin period, have vast casts of characters and constantly shifting perspectives, and they do probe more deeply into perpetration and complicity. For example, of First Circle's definitive 96 chapter version, nearly a third of the chapters are focalized partly or fully through officials, from the lowliest guards up to Stalin himself. And beyond this substantial sort of perpetrator narrative, there are brief but prominent comments on the free population of Moscow, free in quotation marks, and these powerfully evoke other forms of complicity and implication, and this is something that he then explores further in Gulag Archipelago. If we look at Gulag fiction sort of more broadly, there are certainly many perpetrators to be found. Across works of the last century, Gulag officials and functionaries appear repentant, idealistic, fanatical, sadistic, cynical, or maybe confused. But in the book, I apply a somewhat stricter definition of perpetrator fiction in the mere presence of perpetrator characters. And here again, I find Holocaust fiction frameworks helpful. So a perpetrator turn in Holocaust fiction and film is usually dated to the 1990s and early 2000s. Perpetrator fiction, that is narratives from the perspective of perpetrators, continue to provoke controversy on the grounds that they perhaps unduly have humanized or even excused perpetrators. But the growing body of literature on perpetrator fiction argues that it can sort of mobilize and manage media sympathy, keeping it off balance. It's a sort of kinetic process that makes readers reflect, expose, and unsettle their own ethical assumptions, and to think more broadly about perpetration and broader complicity and implication. So Gulag fiction, as I've mentioned already, did not take such a sharp perpetrator turn as Holocaust fiction, and that's partly because perpetrators and a sort of perpetrator fiction more strictly were present from the start. Mikhail Geller, in an early study of Soviet-era camp literature, which I think is still quite underrated as a study, argued that its initial works contain many psychological portraits of what he called the repentant Chekist. But this unsurprisingly, of course, recedes in returning prose. But in post-Stalinist Samizdat and Tamizdat by non-returning writers, including Grossman, Vladimir, and Dovlatov, we can see that perpetrator fiction really thrives. So Vasily Grossman's profound interest in perpetration and implication in atrocity is evident in his major Tamizdat works, Life and Fate and Everything Flows. These interests have often been linked to the author's sense of the ethical compromises that allowed him to survive Stalinism relatively unscathed, especially the post-war anti-Semitic campaigns, and also to an ongoing sort of interest and uncertainty about the circumstances of his mother's death at the hands of the Nazis in 1941. His magnum opus, Life and Fate, like First Circle, is preoccupied with the ethical pressures of incarceration and freedom alike, and it asks us to compare the two. The novel's, again, very large cast of characters are variously connected to Soviet and Nazi repression, and they present a wide and subtle spectrum of complicity, perpetration, and occasional resistance. Most, though, such as the main character, Viktor Shturm, a scientist, or the many old Bolshevik protagonists, are far from innocent victims. They're variously and often deeply implicated in atrocity, and this has been a major focus, actually, of Grossman's studies for quite a while already. It was much more sort of recognized than in other writers of his time. But unlike Solzhenitsyn, Grossman sees individual integrity as little match for the totalitarian state's awesome power to break human lives and wills. So Georgy Vladimir had a personal stake in the Gulag from his mother's imprisonment in the 1950s, but was conscious of not wanting or being able to write about the Gulag as Solzhenitsyn and Shalamov did. It was only when a Novi Mir colleague returned with a story of dogs howling at the gates of an abandoned camp in Kazakhstan that he happened upon his new approach, and that was in the early 1960s. It produced the novella Faithful Ruslan, Verny Ruslan, which was released in Samizdat in Germany, and in Tamizdat in 1975 in Germany, and domestically in Glasnost. It was also quickly made into a film. Sergei Dovlatov, who was conscripted to serve as a camp guard in the 60s, drew on those experiences for The Zone, a 1982 Tamizdat novel told from guards' perspectives. And in the book, I grouped together these two texts as what I see as the truest example of perpetrator fiction and its ethical potential in the tradition, though I think it does also show some of the limitations of this kind of fiction. So just to sort of recap, so closeness to perpetrator perspectives is often praised for producing a more fine-grained view of agency and moral responsibility that provokes ethical reflection in readers. But as Robert Eagleston points out, this sort of close and fine-grained perspectives can still swerve fundamental questions about causation and agency and systemic issues. So Faithful Ruslan is told predominantly from the perspective of a camp guard dog, who feels confused and sad at the closure of his previous camp and his de facto removal from the service, which he always puts in all caps. His zeal and nostalgia for camp work is seen up close as he struggles to understand and come to terms with the new conditions. But another omniscient narrator offers a more distanced and ironic perspective on that struggle. But that narrator also provides some explanation and possibly even some exoneration. He points to the influence of his training and his innate canine devotion to duty. And Ruslan's behaviour is also contrasted, somewhat flatteringly, to his more cynical master, a lowly human camp guard. So faithful Ruslan maintains a close focus on lowly perpetrators, and especially on one who's naturally, sort of innately predisposed to hyper-obedience. And I'd argue that this does, in fact, complicate questions of agency and responsibility, and it forces the reader to navigate the discomfort of feeling both sympathy and revulsion for perpetrators. Dovlatov's The Zone, which is subtitled The Notes of a Guard, offers disconnected and fragmentary anecdotes of guard life and shows the camp, the criminal camp, as an ecosystem of violence, affecting and even traumatizing those on both sides of the barbed wire. The narrator insists on the striking similarity of characteristics between guards and prisoners, and in a series of sort of meta-narrative interventions, explicitly challenges the assumptions of the preceding wave of Gulag prose, notably Solzhenitsyn. So The Zone and Faithful Ruslan then both probe deep into the lives of lowly Gulag functionaries and reveal the ethical and emotional complexity of day-to-day work in the state apparatus. But this does indeed, I think, swerve some larger questions about the system. Compared with these texts' ethical subtlety, though, post-Soviet perpetrator fiction, I think, invites much greater suspicion and criticism that it's seeking to humanize and even exonerate its protagonists. So the novels of Guzel Yakhina and Zakhar Pliepin, which I mentioned at the start, place a really quite disturbing emphasis on the fascination and attraction that surrounds the figure of the camp boss. So in Yakhina's novel, Ignatov is both a romantic and a sexual hero, and to some extent is presented as a victim of the Gulag. His intimate narrative, which takes up almost as much space as Zuleyka's, shows a growing torment derived directly from the ethical strains of Gulag work. And I see it as a narrative of perpetrator trauma. I think that's probably the best way to understand it. And this notion that perpetrators can be traumatized by their own actions in the course of duty is a growing focus of very recent perpetrator studies, but it remains very controversial for obvious reasons. But in this case, at least domestically in Russia, perpetrator trauma proved much less contentious than Zuleyka's liberation. It didn't seem to be terribly problematic for most viewers or readers. A similar insistence on the moral complexity of the early Gulag characterized The Abode, in which a fictional version of the real-life 1920s boss, Fyodor Eichmann's, plays a key role. Here, the novel's narrative does remain throughout with the perspective of a criminal prisoner, but nonetheless, Eichmann has often been identified as the real hero. He's been called the center of the universe, bewitching, charming, superhuman, and other sort of epithets. So many critics really point to him as the kind of hidden real hero. Unlike in Zuleyka, though, his image is woven out of others' projections and fantasies. There are several postscripts to the novel which sort of extend this beyond the plot itself. So it adds on, for example, the diary of his Czechist lover Galina, and the author's own fictionalized visit to Eichmann's granddaughter. So Eichmann's never attempts to bare his soul or to explain his actions. And in that sense, I think the parallels that were often drawn with Jonathan Littell's influential perpetrator confession novel, The Kindly Ones, was somewhat misplaced. Prilepin's boss protagonist remains enigmatic and elusive, but this only really intensifies the fascination that surrounds him. So these two best-selling novels then represent two different types of perpetrator fiction, but both, I think, provoke complicated feelings in prisoner characters within the world of the novel and in readers and then viewers. In blurring the lines between victim and perpetrator and frustrating categorical moral judgment, these novels, I'd argue, share some common ground with recent state policy on Gulag public memory. As I noted earlier, this tends to prefer balanced or neutral narratives to outright condemnation of the institution or retroactive judgment of its functionaries. This links then finally to the fact that Gulag fiction has always been a literature of memory and inextricably intertwined with memory politics. In the Soviet period, of course, Zeks could usually only write down their experiences after they returned from the camps, though Solzhenitsyn famously memorized many drafts of his works while there. Later, he'd go on to combine his memories with over 220 other testimonies to create what he called the communal friendly monument of the Gulag Archipelago. And this was intended to puncture the silence around the camps that he's seen descend in late socialist public memory. Shalamov also reflected often in his writings on memory's gaps and the pain, but also the necessity of remembering in order to contribute to collective memory. And much later on, contemporary writers often deploy survivor testimony, working with Memorial and other organizations working to preserve memories of Soviet repression. So Gulag fiction in all of those senses is built out of memories, but I'd argue it's also often a literature about memory that dramatizes the processes and purposes of remembering the camps. And these texts have also tended to be towards the periphery of a corpus dominated by more direct testimony. So returnee heroes who are intent on communicating memory of the Gulag to post-Stalinist society, the principal heroes of Grossman's Everything Flows and Solzhenitsyn's Cancer Ward. In Solzhenitsyn's novel, the defiant returnee, Oleg Kostoglotov, enters hospital soon after the Gulag, and he insists there on glasnost about literal illness and the poisonous legacies of the camps alike. In Grossman's more experimental novella, Ivan Grigorovich returns to Moscow after nearly 30 years of exile and incarceration. Unlike Kostoglotov, he's a largely silent and passive figure who provokes and receives others' testimonies largely without judgment, but his quiet determination to confront personal and national memories and guilt presents an exemplary alternative to official memory politics of the time that he returns to. But neither returnee is shown as having much effect on the public memory of the societies that they come back to. Other post-Stalinist works, though, suggested that such remembrance was not just externally politically constrained. As in Holocaust fiction, second-generation texts by children of Gulag prisoners are haunted by traumatic memories difficult to communicate in public or in private. Holocaust literature and art of the second generation often express the burden of living with a traumatic past that had not been fully articulated even within the family. Second-generation writing is pervaded by self-consciousness about the elusive and fragmented post-memory of suffering. And very similar dynamics of memory and post-memory can be seen in Vasily Aksionov's Tamizdat novel, The Burn, and Bulat Akudjava's stories, The Girl of My Dreams and Unexpected Happiness, both published in Glasnost. These are all stories by and featuring sons of imprisoned mothers. In Akudjava's stories, which again I think are rather underrated, perhaps less known than they should be, this is amongst the earliest Gulag prose to emerge during Glasnost. A son struggles to communicate with his mother who's returned from the camps, dashing hopes for a happy reunion. The mother's memories of the camps are powerfully felt and sort of palpable in the atmosphere, but they're only partially articulated across the generations by the end of the stories. And then finally, to come to contemporary literature about the camps again, this has often originated in the urge to testify not to parents, but to grandparents or even great-grandparents' unspoken experiences. Contemporary Gulag fiction offers a striking number of grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and grandfather, grandparent, and great-grandparent characters who are on memory quests. Notably, the two texts I mentioned earlier, Sergei Lebedev's The Limit of Forgetting and Vodolaskin's Aviator of 2016. Both novels show truth and lies about the Gulag, entangling older and younger generations, and Gothic, fantastical, and grotesque narrative evoke the haunting of contemporary society by this past. But they point to very different ways to mourn and even move on from these memories, and different roles for individual and collective in doing so. So just briefly to take Aviator before finishing with Lebedev. So Aviator tells the story, as I mentioned earlier, of a cryogenically frozen returnee who's thawed in Russia of 1999. And it traces how a former Talovki inmate sort of gradually recovers his memories of the Soviet period as he is thawed. There's a complicated sort of relationship that he develops with the granddaughter of his lover from his pre-prison period, so he sort of becomes both a father and a grandfather. So it's a very complicated kind of transgenerational situation. But so this returnee gradually reconstructs his time in Solovki in the 20s and 30s, but consistently refuses to pass judgment on the perpetrators of that suffering or on the Soviet system, even though in the 1990s, the Gulag past is shown as really acceptable and even fashionable to discuss. But right at the end, the last memory to re-emerge reveals that actually he was guilty of a violent crime and is not quite an innocent victim of Soviet repression. The novel concludes that the complexity of individual guilt and innocence, and he's called Inakiente, somewhat symbolically or ironically, it rendered impossible a one-size-fits-all approach to Gulag memory. And this accords with Vodolaskin's often voiced belief that history and ethics are rooted on the level of the human soul. Olga Boguslavskaya has criticized this focus on individual psychology and ethics for equating human fallibility with more systemic atrocities and guilt. Finally, then, Sergei Lebedev's Limit of Forgetting, the last text I'll look at today and on which the book also finishes, also revolves around intergenerational memory, but it links together personal, familial, and societal remembrance in ways much closer to that kind of collective, systemic perspective that Boguslavskaya appeals for. So Limit, like Aviator, has this semi-Gothic story at its heart. It recounts a young man's quest to solve the mystery of a family friend who became a quasi-grandfather through saving his life as a child with a blood transfusion. Improbable as it may sound, this Zap's grandfather was inspired by a real relative of the author, the second husband of one of his grandmothers. So Limit, I would say, is Gulag literature's quintessential, contemporary Gulag literature's quintessential post-memory text. And it established Lebedev as the leading contemporary exponent of memory and post-memory prose, the most recent one being 2024's collection titled Limit dramatizes later generations' difficult reconstruction of memories, though of guilt rather than victimhood. The narrator of Limit searches for clues to his grandfather's life in photos, objects, and letters. He then goes off to the camp settlement where he worked and confirms that he was in fact a Gulag boss. The narrator then realizes that he must dig deeper into Gulag memory, and like Lebedev himself, he's a trained geologist, so literally it involves digging as well as sort of metaphorical digging into the past. He then visits a former exile site where he encounters some ancient surviving Zeks, and then plunges into a pit of prisoner corpses preserved by the permafrost. And this lengthy and painful post-memory quest eventually has a happy ending. It makes sense of the grandson's identity and it liberates him finally from the ghosts of the past. It also functions as an allegory for the memory work that Russia has still to perform to confront trauma and guilt and finally move forward. Lebedev is not only the contemporary writer most preoccupied with memory and post-memory, but also, and I think not coincidentally, the most involved in memory politics. He's consistently protested constraints on Gulag commemoration, albeit in recent years from emigration in Germany, and he's often used his literary representations of memory to do so. For example, he's praised many times the imprisoned memorial activist Yuri Dmitriev's unearthing of Gulag burial sites in places far from the eyes and memory, and praised the fact that he is building, quote, an aggregate of memory. These are all actions that are very strikingly reminiscent of his debut novel's narrator. He's also reprised the novel's imagery to criticize official memory politics. And he was doing this back in the 2010s already. For example, in one critique of that time, he said the Stalinist repressions have been suspended, stuck in a permafrost. No one in their right mind wants to live as a descendant of unpunished butchers and murderers, end quote. So Lebedev's literary and non-literary writing appeals to the personal and collective confrontation of shameful memories, but this stance, of course, became more and more at odds with official efforts to control and foreclose public discussions of the Gulag and Stalinism, and even, as we see in Dmitriev and many other examples, to prosecute their advocates. So given that Gulag prose has already diversified beyond its original consciousness-raising and anti-Soviet orientation in the ways that I hope I've shown today, it is possible to envisage a situation where Pierre Canal airs more palatable Gulag dramas and novels about the camps, continue to be awarded national book prizes and so on. But amidst the sharp re-Stalinization of memory politics and censorship, especially since 2022, but not only then, a wave of emigration that's taken several, but not all Gulag fiction writers out of the country, and of course a growing number, very sharply growing number of contemporary political prisoners, it seems likely that Gulag fiction will remain frozen in place for now. So the image of permafrost that has haunted Gulag writing from Shalamov and Solzhenitsyn to Lebedev and Remizov and many others continues to resonate with Russia's uneasy relationship with its Gulag past and with writers' attempts to excavate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this tour you for us through several decades of Gulag writing. So now is the time for you, the audience, both the virtual one, but primarily the one here physically. So any questions you have, starting with Nastya? And please, for the virtual audience, could you raise your virtual hand so that I can flag you and
Thank you so much, Holly, for this indeed really tremendous and very expensive talk. My question is about whether or not in reading so vastly across literature that deals with the topic of the Gulag, you've noticed several perhaps stylistic traditions or genre traditions, and whether those traditions align with the kind of political interpretation or political mobilization of the history of the Gulag. One of the things that I was struck with during the talk was the way in which, for example, melodrama is consistently engaged by not exactly apologists of Gulag, but right. So Bilepin and I was also thinking in even in cinema we have that in Дорогие товарищи, the protagonist finds reconciliation in the arms of an NKVD agent in Thurston Smirnov film. It's this kind of the same story. So this kind of sexual catharsis between the victim of NKVD and the agent is somehow smoothes over the story. And then of course we have Shalamov with his kind of very adamant resistance to melodrama, to plot, but at the same time, he's so deeply engaged in a very specific tradition of writing about by political prisoners and writing of political mobilization of this experience of dehumanization. So I was wondering if you could comment on that. So did you find within this broad kind of strata of Gulag literature certain similarities or parallels between the style of writing and kind of political interpretation of this?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Thank you so much, Nastya. Yeah, I mean, this question of melodrama is really interesting, and I think one of the criticisms that's often leveled against sort of perpetrator fiction or perpetrator film in particular is that it often has these kind of very sort of troubling love stories, almost like Stockholm syndrome between guards and prisoners, and that this is something that clearly is ethically very troubling. And it's true actually that the two the puzzle that I started with of sort of why Prilepin and Yakin, I mean, it's not really a puzzle in the sense that I think they both do introduce this sort of emotional complexity, which precisely kind of causes this kind of sort of blunts the potential political edge of the stories that they tell, and I think take it back into a closer resemblance to the sort of bad old days of sort of perpetrator film as something that fundamentally does sort of blur the boundaries and sort of confuse the ethical stakes of the system. I mean, I think that is something that certainly one can see in the contemporary period, which I think does accord in the way that you were describing with the kind of political or the sort of blunting of the sort of traditional sort of politicization of writing about the Gulag. I think the other thing which I tried to sort of well, there's two other things maybe. One is the use of sort of epic narrative in a broad sense. Which we can see again, I think Prilepin, for example, combines, I would say, sort of melodrama and epic in very interesting and again quite troubling ways. And I think that is I mean, and he when he was publicizing the abode, he spoke very explicitly and sort of typically sort of provocatively about wanting to write very differently from Solzhenitsyn, but obviously, there are some sort of, in terms of sort of genre and the kind of shape of the narrative, there are some interesting similarities, but I think precisely he's kind of trying to kind of take that sort of the big novel about the Gulag and sort of introduce much more sort of ethical and complexity and ambivalence into it. As far as the other thing I wanted to say, which I think you alluded to briefly in your remarks about Shalamov writing within a very different tradition, is the use of sort of documentary forms, and there aren't a huge number of examples, but Kanonov clearly is very explicitly describes his work as a documentary roman. And even though the sources themselves are rather patchy, it is very much on the boundary of sort of documentary and novelistic narrative. So, and is clearly intended as a very strong criticism of the camp system, and is very clearly aligned with the agenda of Memorial. It's not just that he was working there, but is intended as a kind of intervention there. And in some ways, I sort of see it as really the last work sort of written in that vein, really, about the Gulag in 2019. I think Remizov's novel, I think, is very different for a different set of reasons, but I think is sort of trying to produce a kind of essentially a village prose version of the Gulag and its kind of place within the landscape. But yeah, it's a really excellent question, and it's too big to do justice to, really. But I think you're absolutely right that there is a kind of genre history that tracks, in certain respects, that tracks the kind of political mobilization of Gulag memory.
Maya?
Thanks, Polly. That was such a great talk. I actually want to say something that follows up on what you were saying, Natia, which is like something that occurs to me as a possible helpful genre categorization within what you're talking about is exploitation, right? Like it's like already there's a long and storied tradition of all sorts of Holocaust exploitation literature and film. Maybe we can class various like perpetrator narratives under that rubric, including but not limited to Schindler's List.
Yes.
I mean, I think Schindler's List is all about the sexy Nazi, like there's so many other sort of
And the good nut,
and the good nut, right? It's like exactly like there's so many involutions in the perpetrator genre, but it all is part of like exploitation, and I feel like that also helps explain why something like I Beat It can be made into a TV, like why amid things like the shutting down of Memorial and the like arrest and incarceration of Dmitriev, do we then have like I Beat It as a TV show? It's because it responds to the desire for exploitation. This thing about like finding reconciliation in the arms of the NKVD agent, and what could be more perfect for the like contemporary authoritarian constellation in Russia?
I completely agree, and I think the sort of commercial sort of potential of this work is clearly important. I mean, Yakina's novel in particular has I don't know the exact figures, but has been a bestseller, and clearly has done something right there. And Ulitskaya's blurb on the cover of the novel is something like, that you can get it right, but something like you can find happiness in hell. This kind of something like, I mean, it has hell and it has happiness. I think it may also have love, so we're in the middle. And yeah, the sort of commercial potential again, which is definitely enabled by the fact there is this kind of broader sort of ambivalence around the Gulag. I mean, I think in the case of Yakina, well, I think from Yakina and Prilyapin, they have different reasons for their ambivalence about it. I mean, I think from everything that Yakina has said publicly about this, she does want to honor that testimony from which the novel grew. I don't think it's a purely kind of cynical sort of commercialization of the story, but the fact is, I'm sure its commercial appeal does rest on the fact that it is, it is not an entirely bleak story of the camps. In Prilyapin's case, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, he intends it explicitly to be a kind of intervention in what he sees as an I mean, he very much groups together everything. So he doesn't see this kind of big difference between Solzhenitsyn and Shalamov, although he specifically targets Solzhenitsyn and Gulag Archipelago. He calls it like a collection of baiki, so a collection of anecdotes, sort of typically kind of scandalous thing to say. But in his case, yeah, he's trying to sort of write against it, but specifically by writing about Solovki. So I mean, that's the other thing I think, is that there is, the other thing about those two contemporary works is that they are both looking at parts of the Gulag as an institution that are kind of on the, not on the edges exactly, but Solovki before the kind of full institutionalization of the Stalinist Gulag, the special settlements as having this, special status within the system. So, they're not they're not claiming that, the Kalima has these kind of stories necessarily, but the fact that there are these parts of the Gulag and these parts of Gulag history that can be written about in this way and that have that kind of potential to be written about. And again, actually, in the reception of Pridepin, there's quite a lot of really interesting discussion about whether Solovki is, an integral part of Gulag history or whether it's somehow separate, and there are arguments you can make both for and against that, but this kind of, mystical sort of idea that Solovki is not really quite of the Gulag and therefore one can write about it in this rather different way. That's where the whole project of the novel arose for Pridepin. He calls it kind of the end of the Silver Age as well as the beginning of the Gulag.
Thank you so much for this really thoughtful and insightful survey of this literature. And I want to say it makes sense that you focused on like the moral and psychological human element. But I'm wondering if you have anything to say about the natural world, and particularly about, which plays obviously a big role in at least a lot of literature that I've read, which is not anywhere near much. But also Faithful Ruslan is such a brilliant novel, and I wonder if there are if there's any other treatment of animals that you can sort of draw on and create some kind of trajectory similar to the one that you've given us about people.
Absolutely, and there has actually been some quite interesting work done on this, on kind of not just on dogs, which are a sort of obvious part of the kind of Gulag sort of natural world, if you like, and also of course things like ice and the sort of permafrost imagery, but also things like birds. There's a really interesting article by Jeff Hardy, I think, about birds in the life of the Gulag, both in reality but also in literature. And I think again, something like Remizov's work, is in a way, one could look at it through its environmental humanities sort of perspective as well, that this is a novel as much about the kind of environmental history and impact of the Gulag. I would argue that possibly that is, well, it's certainly as important for him as an author, I think, as the kind of specifically human impact. And yeah, absolutely. I mean, in a way, one of the things I struggled with sort of trying to work out how to fit all of this story into 40,000 words, was I felt that I was, in a sense, I use this sort of argument between Shalamov and Solzhenitsyn and Demidov to some extent as well as a sort of, to structure my way into this, and also because I do think that it is the sort of major theme that we can see being treated in contemporary prose as well. But to an extent, it is kind of replicating their own ways of thinking, and one could actually kind of slice the history in different ways and look at it in that way. So I think the fact that there's such a focus in the way I look at it on sort of subjectivity and spirituality is in a way replicating the categories that these authors used, and I suppose I wanted to kind of honour that. But you're absolutely right that there's a whole other tradition that one could look at. I mean, having said that, I think Faithful Ruslan is it is probably maybe my favorite work of all of Gulag literature, precisely because it is so interesting the way it uses the animal perspective, and it maps again onto a whole other tradition of Russian literature, which is not Gulag literature at all, but Bulgakov, and then all the kind of classical literature about where animal perspectives are used as a form of kind of estrangement, essentially, I think, and a way of sort of looking at things anew. And that's what makes Faithful Ruslan so sort of refreshing, I think. But yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's just an amazing novel.
I love it.
Yeah,
I love it. And I teach it a lot, and it's always it's always the text that people get most out of, actually. Yeah.
Thanks.
The kind of asterisk on this. Have you seen this exhibit that is still ongoing? It's migrator is called Засушенному верить.
No, I don't think so.
It is organized by an anthropologist, an ethnographer, and it is an exhibit that traces the spreading of plants and seeds through the Gulag system.
Oh, wow.
And I think because kind of seeds would get attached to people's clothes, and kind of thanks to this sort of natural research, this woman was able to find the exact locations of some of the camps that were so ruined that they were otherwise invisible in the north. But the curious part about it is that this exhibition, it has a website with a lot of information on it kind of keeps on touring around the kind of provincial Russia.
Oh, right.
Even after the closure of Memorial, so there's some kind of interesting substitution that when you shift the story into the story of the natural world
Yes.
rather than political history, then it becomes possible to smuggle this information.
Yeah. And yeah, and I think also thank you for that, and I'd like to talk to you more about that afterwards, actually, because I don't know about that exhibition. I think another thing that I would maybe add from what you've just described is that there is a particular sort of provincial, and I use the term advisedly, but sort of non-metropolitan provincial sort of story and memory of the Gulag that is actually very complicated as well. And there's some really good work being done on this, especially by Susanna Bogomil, which sort of looks at this as a sort of saying, actually, you know, Gulag memory is so intertwined with the history of these places, and often in, you know, Kraevedersky Museum, for example, in provincial spaces, especially those that were kind of very much sort of dominated by the Gulag or created by the Gulag, that you see often these narratives of the Gulag that look very different from metropolitan ones, that sort of have a more complicated story of sort of local pride and the local contribution to the national story, which is another, I think, added complication in this sort of overall kind of shifts in Gulag memory. So anyway, I would sort of have to add that, but that sounds, yeah, that sort of environmental. I mean, I really hope there's more done on the environmental history of the Gulag. I know Tyler Kirk's been doing some really great work on that, actually. He's at Alaska, Tyler Kirk. But there's a lot more to do, clearly.
I see a virtual hand behind us, and Anatoly Pinsky, could you unmute yourself?
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
Polly, thanks so much for the excellent talk. And I really look forward to reading the book. I have a quick question that might be a little strange and may not go anywhere, but I'm interested in your response. And it has to do with a kind of long-term structural role of the writer in Russian society. And I'm particularly interested in the Soviet period. Although if the post-Soviet period is relevant, I'd be interested in hearing about that too. And that structural sort of position of the writer in Russian society, I'm interested in if any of your authors may have engaged at all with Stalin's having occupied that position. So for example, Stalin being presented in the 1930s and later as the author of the Stalin Constitution, for example. And so is there any, and especially because Gulag writers are dealing with the legacy of a certain approach to the law, a certain approach to the Stalin Constitution, and other aspects of the law, if there's any engagement with sort of Stalin's position or sort of Stalin's pretense to occupying the role of the writer in Soviet society, if that makes sense. So if there's any explicit discussion or a sort of effort to take this role away to remove Stalin from that position and to reoccupy that role. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I suppose one thing that springs to mind, which is a very obvious example in some ways, is Gulag Archipelago as a kind of polyphonic kind of riposte to any kind of idea of sort of monolithic or monologic authorship. And so I mean, that would be one possible example. Of course, you know, Stalin also features as a character in several of the novels that I talked about, or the prose works that I talked about. Most notably in Third Circle, where again there's a kind of extended sort of parody of Stalin's theory of linguistics, but again it was sort of embedded in a broader narrative of kind of disrupting Stalin's kind of monolithic authorship of what Soviet society or Stalinist society is, and silencing the Gulag and so on. But I don't know if that's really I don't know if that in any way answers your question, but that's sort of what springs to mind. Is that in any way help? Was that the kind of thing you were thinking of, Anatoly?
Sorry,
Oh,
you
sorry.
should be able to unmute now.
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to unmute. Yeah, that helps. I mean, I wasn't, I was feared that there wouldn't be an example. It's just the sort of is an itch that I wanted to scratch, sort of this, you know, if there is any kind of explicit engagement with what seems to be a, you know, there's just this interesting continuity across Soviet history where, you know, often we talk about after 1953, how writers are reoccupying a role that they may have occupied in the early 20th century and in the 19th century, but there may be a continuity here because if you take into account that Stalin is occupying that role himself. And so I'm just wondering if Stalin was occupying that role according to the terms of the Stalin cult, if perhaps these writers who are very much obviously engaging with the legacies of Stalinism have in any way engaged with Stalin's pretenses to occupy a literary role in society. But it was just an itch that I was interested in scratching. And
I can't think of any. I'll think about that more, and I can always email you if other things spring to mind. I suppose the only other thing I'd add, which is again is not quite, I think, exactly what you're talking about, but I was just thinking back to Margaret Szolkowski's study of some images of Stalin in unofficial post-Stalinist literature, and the way that she talks about them as sort of creating this kind of quite, in a way, limited and self-replicating kind of set of tropes to sort of depict Stalin, and that, you know, he always has sort of pockmarked face and sort of eyes like a tiger and these other tropes. But again, that's not quite what you're getting at, but I will think about that more. Thank you, Anatoly.
Maybe one last question.
Holly, I don't wait to read the book.
Oh, thank you.
Here's my question. You mentioned Yevgenia Ginsburg and her influence on her as a source for her son, Vasily Antonovich. I just wondered, is there a separate category of women's camp fiction? And
Yeah.
I'm thinking that vulnerability, needs of women in the camp, and the possibility of exploitation, especially sexual exploitation, which is sort of scattered through the works of some of these male writers, but I'm not sure that I think everyone would see it quite differently.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for raising that. It's something that perhaps I should have sort of made more explicit in the talk, is that the sort of overwhelming predominance of male authors was really something I found quite difficult, actually. Even that I remember talking to Martin Bobietsky about this, and you know, we were both sort of trying, you know, with the way that sort of I defined or grouped these texts together, that it was really hard to, you know, to find female authors, which is not to say that, you know, male authors couldn't sort of in helpful ways kind of foreground aspects of female, specifically female experience of the Gulag, but really, you know, in the book, the only two female authors that I really discuss are Yakina at some length, and then briefly Ulitskaya, so her novel Jacob's Ladder, which is again about much more than the Gulag, but it's quite an interesting sort of, has quite an interesting post-memory sort of granddaughter sort of narrative that she reconstructs. But yeah, I suppose one of the things I struggled with is that, you know, women make such an enormous contribution to the memoir literature, enormous and distinctive and really important. You know, some of the studies that I was talking about earlier, you know, I think that is why that they sort of look at memoir and fiction together, is in order to bring in these female voices. But actually, strictly speaking, sort of Gulag fiction, as I've defined it, is there are very few female authored works. And why is itself an interesting question. I suspect it's to do with a sort of certain type of anxiety of influence, perhaps, or that simply, you know, to sort of, I suppose, recap Barbara Held's, you know, very old argument now about the ways that documentary forms or quasi-documentary forms and quasi-autobiographical forms have often been more productive for female writers trying to write themselves into a broader national tradition. I don't know, but it is something that I sort of struggle with, and I do talk about it more in the book. But yeah, it's a very defined as I've defined it. It's a very overwhelmingly male-dominated tradition. In which context, I don't find it terribly helpful the way Yakin writes about the camps. You know, so you wait like nearly 100 years for a sort of best-selling Gulag novel by a woman, and then it is sort of problematic in the various ways that I've described. But maybe that's exactly what it takes to write a bestseller at this point, as I think came up in the first question. Yeah.
Thank you, Polly. This was really fantastic, and I particularly appreciated your very expanded view of Gulag literature, because I remember when I was nearly 20 years ago about to apply to graduate schools, I applied with this project of comparative studies of camp literature in Germany and the Soviet Union, and I remember very distinctly operated with a very narrow view of Gulag literary canon, Solzhenitsyn and Shalamov as the main ones, with the secondary of Vadimov and Ginsburg and Grossman, but all of them essentially ending somewhere in the all texts written between the 50s and the 70s, and I really it has remained frozen until today. But now, thanks to you, not only I, but all of us who have a much more expanded understanding of a Gulag canon that is still living and is still producing fiction. And so thank you for this, and thank you to all of you for coming here. We'll, if Polly doesn't mind, we'll hang around for a few minutes before whisking her off to lunch.